So good morning, everyone, and welcome to our pre-August bank holiday episode of Road to Recovery, which is our series of commentaries on the COVID-19 crisis. Every month, we talk with business and thought leaders, and we try and reflect on what the pandemic has taught us. So we think together with you, our listeners, about what this means for the future of HR, for finance, technology, work. And this month, we're diving into the hot topic of the Great Resignation, which some of you may have heard of. And we're going to think, Michael and I, about what we as business and HR leaders can do about the Great Resignation. I'm Becky Statham. If you haven't met me before, I'm one of the principal consultants at Varan. And I've been working with businesses and technology companies like SAP SuccessFactors, who we've got today, for the last 8 years to future-proof HR. So thinking about better use of data, technology insights, creating a better culture so that we can be, a fit for the future business. And obviously that future looks very different now because of COVID-19. For anyone who doesn't know Varan, we're a technology agnostic company. So been around for about 8-9 years, and we help businesses with their HR and finance problems and with transformation of HR and finance, often enabled by technology. If you've got any questions on any of that, feel free to connect with me personally or give us a call. And today I'm really excited to be joined by Micheal Esau. So Michael is the Global HR Advisor at SAP SuccessFactors, and somebody who, like me, has been interviewing business and thought leaders over the years. And we've been thinking together about the Great Resignation, really from 2 points of view. We've been thinking about why people leave organizations and why people stay. So that's going to be the core of our webinar today. So Michael, thank you so much for coming on the webinar.
Thank you, Becky. Great to be here.
Good. So I've got some questions that I want to work through, but on your screens, you should see a Q&A and your chat function. So send us comments, send us your questions as we go through. It's much more fun for Michael and I if you interact with us. So please feel free to do that. So let's get stuck in. I think lots of people have seen and read about the Great Resignation, Michael, but if they haven't, what is it? What's it all about? And should we be worried about it?
Well, I think that's a good point. Should we be worried about it? I think you and I, prior to today, were discussing how real is it? So what is the research telling us? What are the commentators telling us? Is that as we've come through the pandemic, as we come through this seismic change, as we try and get to a new place. I'm not going to talk about a new normal because I'm not sure what that means anymore. Are people making decisions about whether or not they wish to stay with their current employment or current opportunity and head for pastures new? And what the data is telling us is that, through surveys, etc., but even actually, if you look at factual data, if you look at the US in May, 2.5 million people changed their job. There is obviously some truth to this, and other data is telling us that a high percentage are considering or will indeed, and a lot of it is down to how they feel about their existing experience. So is it real? The data suggests it is. Should we be worried? I think we'll discuss that.
Good. Okay, so why do you think there is this temptation to leave? Why are people thinking about whether it's time to move on?
Oh, that is a huge question. See, I take quite a different view to this. So a lot of people are obviously looking at the length of the pandemic and a very sort of clear-cut view of, have people reflected on that experience? Have they felt cared for? Have they felt supported? All of these things as they've come through the pandemic. And for many, the decision has been, well, no, I haven't felt supported for whatever reason, and therefore I'm not going to put up with it. Now, for me personally, I think what the pandemic has done has actually just shined this enormous light on what was probably starting 3, 4, 5 years ago. Because I think our expectations and our preferences had started to shift pre-pandemic. But I think it's just heightened it massively through these last 18 months.
Yeah, because we've been talking for a long time about the gig economy and flexible working and agility. And I was looking this morning at whether this 40% of people looking to leave in the next 6 to 12 months or whatever it might be, is that bad? Like, how does that compare to normal? And actually, there's articles from 2018, 17, 19, with similar stats saying, oh, everyone's going to leave. So maybe you're right. It's been on the radar for a while. I mean, I've got a question for you and for our listeners, really, which is, do you know who from your organization is thinking about leaving and why? And it's a bit of a rhetorical question because we have a really good answer for this at Varrow, which I'd love to share with you and get your views on. We've been doing these stay surveys, and these were something that we started before all of this stuff about the Great Resignation, actually. And the stay survey is the opposite of an exit interview. So instead of waiting for someone to resign and asking them why they're going, you ask people what they like, what they dislike about their work. Have they ever thought about leaving? And if they did, why? And why did they stay, if they haven't resigned at that point? And it has been the most insightful thing that I've done in the last 8 years of being at Varrow. It's honestly been amazing and quite moving because some of the responses you get are really emotional. So, I want to just talk about some of the things that have come up in that survey, because I think that this might be reflective of the general population, or maybe it's specific to consulting or specific to a boutique organization. But we had kind of 4 common reasons. So, we said, have you ever thought about leaving and why? And I guess the other thing around this is that people were very honest. So we're lucky that we have a culture where people feel that they can be honest. So that's benefited us a lot. And I guess if that's not the case in your business, that's a different issue to tackle. So the 4 reasons we had, and this is not a multiple choice question, this is an open question that we have either face to face or we do it on Teams. And the first thing was they just they fancied something new. They thought, maybe I'm going to go for an internal HR role. I want to be a HR generalist or a HR VP, or I want to join a technology firm. So lots of them just fancy to change, just fancy something new. The second one is a very practical one. They were able to take calls from headhunters and respond to, messages on LinkedIn and so on, where practically they couldn't when they were in the office. So some people weren't even really looking. It's just that they could entertain those calls where they couldn't before. And then they ended up being, sold an opportunity. Opportunities to work on different projects. So, we're a consultancy, we're very project-based. So one of the top reasons was, there were projects elsewhere on different technologies, or, in a different line of work, or, more to do with that or less to do with that, that I wanted to try out. So the opportunities in the actual work itself, work-life balance, a bit, consulting firms, and also during lockdown, right? Work-life balance really hits you. If there's no life, because you're not socializing and going to the pub, the work bit feels, very intense. And then actually, furlough. So again, from a very practical point of view, the people that went on furlough at the start of lockdown, maybe because they weren't full-time on a client project, they said, well, I just had time. I had time to have a look around. And I thought, it's a bit of uncertainty, isn't it? It brings a bit of uncertainty to people, furlough, which was a new concept. So it did make people kind of have a look around. Do any of those surprise you or resonate with things that you've heard?
They resonate massively, don't they? I think one of the things I think that's really interesting is that, and we talked about this morning, didn't we? That whether or not this data is real or it's right or it's wrong, we can't be complacent, right? I think that's the key word for me. That when there is a shortage of skills in the market. Right, it is unbelievably competitive. We're seeing that at the moment, right? There are shortages in certain areas. You can't be complacent, and organizations are living and breathing organisms, and the people you employ are part of that. It evolves daily. Our lives, the whole lives that we live, they don't stand still. Circumstances change, and so we're not fixed. We're not fixed in what we're doing. So none of those surprise me at all. One of the things for me, Becky, right, talking about the complacency and thinking about the Great Resignation, if I go back over the last 20, 25 years of my career, the one thing that I've always been mindful of is what is the context I'm operating in? You know, I go back 20 years, I joined Scottish Power when the energy market was deregulated, right? And so what was the context? Very simple. You didn't have to stay with your energy supplier anymore. It was a free market. It was an open market. All of a sudden, energy providers were dealing with churn. Here we go. The organization wasn't set up for that. It didn't know how to deal with that. I'd never had to deal with churn before. And as I've gone through my career, I've always been blissfully mindful of what is the context. And I think as we look through this context now, as we go into this decade, the biggest context I think we have to look at is what are the expectations and preferences of the people who are coming into the workforce? Because when I look at the points you've raised, you know, one of the ones there was like, I fancy something new, opportunity to work on a different project. I think these are some of the biggest drivers.
Yeah.
People want to achieve. There is a thirst for new experiences, you know, and I think it's not just going out of the organization, but going within the organization, which is as much of a challenge. I gave you the example that at SAP, we have our academy layer, which is super, super crucial to how we see talent into our organization. But we've got some great case studies of individuals who come out of the academy, which is a very, very long and intensive program. They go into role. They may do that role for a year, and then they see this new opportunity somewhere else in the organization. They'll go for a year, then they'll go somewhere else for a year. You have to manage that, you know, and
this,
that's
a lot of people will be able to resonate with this, I'm sure. You know, we did a big piece of research with law firms, and that's very typical in law firms. You know, you spend all this money investing in these trainees, and then you get them qualified, and then they go. You know, it's probably the same with the tech firms when they're, you know, they're getting them certified, and they learn all this code and everything, and they go somewhere else. What can be done? You know, what's the difference between the companies that train people up and then lose them, and the ones that train them up and manage to retain more than average?
Yeah, so I think I think it's almost getting into the, well, what do we do about it, isn't it? It's how do you prevent it? For me, one of the things that we used to see 10, 15, maybe 20 years ago was a very, very clear employee value proposition, right? So individuals could actually clearly resonate and connect with what actually is this organization trying to do from a purpose standpoint. Because I do think we can't ignore that one of the big other drivers why people are looking to leave is because they're not actually connecting with the organization they're working for.
Yeah.
So they don't believe them. They don't feel what the commitment of the brand is. So to your question, what can we do about it? I think we're starting to see organizations go right back to the basic fundamental of what is our employee value proposition. So, you know, we just had a fantastic conversation with Harriet Green on our Human Factor podcast. And Harriet is the ex-CEO at Thomas Cook, Premier Farnell, and latterly was head of IBM for APJ. And she was very, very clear, actually, that, you know, going back over the EVP and really thinking through, what is your proposition? What does it look like? What does it mean? But doing it with the organization. So actually, you know, really looking at across a diverse organization, you know, being as inclusive as you possibly can be to say, what is that? Because I think that's one of the biggest challenges of why do people hit a ceiling, is because actually they don't understand, how can I actually own my career and progress through this organization? I don't know how to do that. I don't know how the support networks work. And I think that's one of the fundamental challenges that organizations have truly got to think about in the next couple of years. Because it's not all, you know, we've got the challenge at SAP. It's not always that you can guarantee that somebody is going to jump into another opportunity. That's hard work. And I think it's a commitment can set you up for trouble. But how can you ensure that somebody is still growing? How can you give exposure? How can you give exposure to new experiences? How can you, you know, create challenges, you know, put people into projects, etc. Because I think that's got to be a big part of the future. Otherwise, talent will say, I'm bored.
Yeah, and I was thinking, as you were talking about, you know, the sectors that the Great Resignation is set to hit most are things like hospitality, retail, healthcare. And there are some things that those groups have in common, those sectors. So one point is that a lot of those people have either been on furlough, so hospitality and retail, really rubbish time, really they've been at home waiting for this to be over so they can get back to work. So that must be really hard on people's mental health. But they're also the ones that are now going to be forced to be back full time in their workplace. And that's really difficult. So I think trying to, I guess purpose and belonging and all of, and opportunities are possibly even more important in those sectors where they've probably had, quite a rough time during lockdown. And then unlike everyone else, you can get a bit of flexible working, bit of home, hybrid. They've got to go straight back in. The contrast is going to hit them quite hard.
It's a great point. Yeah, it is, isn't it? Because I think for some people, this option of hybrid won't exist. You're absolutely right. That they physically have to be in a location. But I think that raises then the question still of how can the organization support physical, virtual, hybrid, right? Because I think that for me is an enormous question. There's no doubting that the challenge for leaders through all of this work is enormous. I think leaders are almost going to have to unlearn, relearn, reimagine actually what is the role of the leader to support these different, groups, scenarios. It's not an easy challenge. Right?
And networks I think are really important. So we are very keen around to get our physical networking events back together. Most of the people on the call have been to one of our networking parties, hundreds of HR people in a room, beers and drinks and a speaker and sharing knowledge. We're trying our best to do it over webinars, but it's not the same. And, I was chatting to the HRD of Skanska yesterday, which is a construction company. And he said, we've nailed hybrid working. We can do flexible working. People, we're making it work, and we are a physical, product-based organization. So there are ways, but I think, getting back out and networking with people to share what's working is really important. Let's talk about, shall we, the three things that came up the most in our stay surveys. So, we first of all say, look, have you ever considered leaving? Why? We've talked a bit about that, opportunities, furlough, things like that. And there were three key reasons, or three and a half really, because I will touch on that purpose that you mentioned, why people stayed. So they had thought about leaving, they decided to stay. So the first one was opportunities again. So actually they decided when they really thought about it, and maybe they spoke to people, maybe they spoke to recruiters and so on, the opportunities at Baran for their own development is unparalleled. They felt they wouldn't be able to get that elsewhere, particularly people that have had the opportunity to be in quite a stretch role. So an opportunity where if they'd applied for that role externally, they probably wouldn't have the credentials. And this hits women more than men, for sure. They were thinking, if I applied for that role in another organisation, there's no way they'd look at my CV and even give me an interview. But at Baran, they felt that was an opportunity they were given, to step into that role and be supported in it. So that was a big one. And actually, I think that the people we've got must be particularly resilient and very positive in the way they look at learning, because some of them said, the project work might have been really hard. Maybe the clients were awful, maybe the workload was a lot, we weren't going to the pubs, maybe the hours were long, but I could see that I was learning a lot from it. So I plowed through because I knew that I'd be, more mature, more developed, more able after this opportunity. So the top one was definitely about opportunities, which I think resonates with what you were saying. The second one was their love for the team. They were like, even if I'm not enjoying the work that much, or this project phase isn't that good, or, I'm struggling with, with the work itself, I love my team, love working with them, have a good time with them, and also don't want to let them down by leaving. So I stayed because of this loyalty to the team. And the third one is loyalty to the business. So although some people felt a bit uneasy during furlough and they felt, maybe I should have a look around, we have had feedback that, because we weren't removing jobs, because, we were keeping people in employment no matter what, and we were making, various sacrifices to keep people, employed, people feel an even stronger sense of loyalty, to the business and to our two founders. And then, just touching on your purpose point, some of the people said, because of our organization, the way we're set out, and our size, we're relatively small, people know what I do and what I'm good at, and they come to me for it. So that I think that sense of purpose, that sense of I know who I am in the organization, I bring my whole self, and people come to me for things that they know I'm good at, really keeps people in an organization. That was really powerful.
Yeah, I love those. I love those. It's interesting. I mean, I can't quite see the Q&A as it comes up, but I know
we'll go through them because there's a lot of really good points coming in.
Yeah, and I could see some of the language popping up about wounded and things of this nature, and I think there are some real deep seated feelings about what's happened, and I think the other interesting thing, Becky, is if you've done a lot of work, right? You've done the stay surveys of why would people leave or why would people stay. There's never been a better opportunity for organizations to listen and actually understand what does the future hold, because again, going back to context, you've got to work with it. I don't think we can fight that we're moving to a hybrid model. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think what data's told us, and I've certainly done my own research, are people more productive working from home than perhaps they are doing a commute and going into the office? Without a shadow of a doubt. There's just no ifs or buts about that. So I love those. I absolutely love. But I think, when you start to get into language like loyalty, then you're really starting to get into people's values, and that's where there's a two-way. It's okay, asking people to be loyal and all of these things, but yeah, loyalty works two ways, right? And I've just seen there forgetting that there's loyalty to oneself. Absolutely. And I think that's certainly what's happening. I think as part of this Great Resignation is that people are taking that step back, looking at themselves, thinking what's actually important to me, my values, my future, how have I been treated, what did that feel like, and those are really informing the decision. Question I have, right, is who's driving a significant element of the future of work? Because one piece of research I saw was that the hybrid is largely being driven by the baby boomers, who've all of a sudden realized, I can have a balance. Actually, a lot of people in that age generation are carers. Let's not ignore this, as you mentioned about the whole person. Who's driving, the thirst for new experiences and the career? Where's that coming from? You can't ignore.
And Nicole mentioned, quite rightly, that there is a lot of opportunity to work from home now online. There's lots of online coaching, online selling. A lot of the, even things like wine tasting that you would think it's got to be face to face, is now all online. So completely right, especially people returning to work and things like that. And Nicole has also said we're forgetting that there is loyalty to oneself. So there is also the perception that all of these people for companies are lifers, meaning that one's looking to stay with a company for 20 plus years. Very unusual. When I see that, I think, God, that company's doing something really, really good. The employment life cycle and drivers have changed significantly in ways that are not necessarily measured by money. 100%, because
Agreed.
None of the, I will talk a tiny bit about salary and money a bit later on in answer to someone else's question, actually, which is about what practical actions are we taking away from the stay surveys. But very few people mentioned money or salary or benefits or compensation. It was all of the other stuff. It was all about opportunities and meaning from work.
Correct. I mean, I reshared this morning on LinkedIn. And if anybody hasn't seen this TED talk, it's a TED talk from 2014 from Boston Consulting Group, a gentleman called Rainer Strack, on the 2030 workforce crisis. So we're going back 7 years, right? And I watch this video periodically, probably once or twice, every year. I will just go back over it and just reaffirm many of the points, because what Rainer talked about was, first of all, we will experience skill shortages simply because of demographics, right? And the second part they did was then to understand from about 200,000 job seekers what was important to them as they come into the world of work. Pay was eighth. Right? Pay was eighth. And when you looked at the top drivers, they were all cultural. Relationship with peers, relationship with manager, the climate they were operating in. And what was number one on the list? Recognition. Right? So I think, you know, I sound a bit boring sometimes when I keep prattling on about the basic fundamentals and executing them brilliantly. But actually, when it really, really boils down, if you understand the DNA of a human being, you know, when we wake up of a morning and we come to work, I don't think anybody wants to come to work to do a bad job, but we need certain things to happen day in, day out for us to go home and say, I had a good day, right? I had a good day. And I think, you know, when organizations do the basics absolutely brilliantly in terms of clarity around what am I here to do? How do I align? What are my objectives? I get really good feedback on a timely basis, so I know how well I'm doing, where I stand, where my gaps are, where I can improve. I understand what the development proposition is, so I know how I fit into that. I have choices. When we do those basics absolutely brilliantly, it makes a fundamental difference. I hate to say this, I just don't think we do those basics brilliantly.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because we ask in the stay survey, you know, do you feel appreciated for the work that you do? You know, and we've had good feedback about that. And this is free. Feedback and appreciation are free. You know, saying thank you, saying good job, well done, is free. You know, I'm going to ask a bit later if there's any companies or initiatives, you know, that we haven't talked about that you think are really good in this area. And I know that Workday, for example, you know, they have Feedback Friday. So as a prompt, you know, because it then creates the culture, every Friday, it's like, right, you know, do your feedback, you know, give some feedback, ask for some feedback. Yeah. And so if you do that enough Fridays, then naturally you start doing it all the time. You know, and we have an always on state engagement survey. So, you know, we used to do an annual engagement survey, and we were like, that's just archaic. We just can't, you know, things change too much and you're capturing what someone feels on that day. So our engagement survey, we use the happiness index, it's on all the time. So you can just go into your browser and add good, bad comments anytime. And we remind people, you know, each week to go in and do something. So yeah, you're right. There are some very basic things and some free things that can be really effective.
Correct.
Richard's asked, and I want to throw this in because it might be a good time to talk about it. Our pal Richard, he said, I wonder if the need for something new is reflective of the amount of choice and the refresh rate in other areas of modern life. You know, everything's always moving, always changing.
I agree.
You know, so I guess there's, on the one hand, it's getting the basics right, and things like recognition are always important, knowing where I'm going, what my opportunities are, where I fit. But, you know, what do we do about this need for novelty?
And I always think this is where part of the issue is. We look for the shiny, don't we? We look for the new toy. It's almost that, you know, thirst for innovation. What is innovation? For me, innovation is only innovation if it works. And innovation could be something that is really small, but it makes a fundamental difference. You have to get the balance right between, you do the basics absolutely brilliantly, but you don't then ignore what actually is changing with the market. And there is no doubt that it's so disruptive. You know, businesses are being hit left, right, and center, you know, in terms of customer choice, demographic, the economic. Obviously, we're going through this pandemic, which is one of the most seismic changes we will ever go through. So, you know, it's not easy what we're describing, but you have to get the balance right between, you know, making sure you've got your finger on the pulse. You've got your, you know what's happening in your market, you know what's happening with your customers, etc., etc. But when it comes to your people, anchor them, truly anchor them. You know, I mean, in not the next episode, in the I think it's episode 9 of our podcast, we're going to be talking with David Williams. David is the founder of Impact International. Now, David, you know, founded Impact about 40 years ago. They're a global leadership and learning organization. And we are going to ask the question, what is the future role of the leader in all of this? Because they have a fundamental role in terms of how these basics are executed every single day. And when you talk about the furlough, people going virtual and people going remote, do leaders know how to create a sense of community? Do they know how to create a sense of collaboration? Are they able to check in, you know, authentically and with empathy, on a regular basis. But not just that psychological safety. Listen, the psychological safety is enormous, especially what we're going through. But don't forget, the human being still wants to feel that they are contributing and helping and making a difference, and they're getting recognized for it. It's really actually multifaceted.
Yeah, talking about the leaders is a good point, because someone's mentioned that in the chat as well, about whether managers and leaders are equipped to do that, and how we people that are good at their jobs get promoted into leadership, into management.
Yes.
What do you think about, and we do this at Varan, giving people the choice about whether they line manage or not? Obviously, some people have to project manage or manage teams day to day, but we have different managers who, they're almost like your careers coach. They look after your development, your well-being, that kind of stuff. Those authentic conversations, the things that you were talking about. Do you think that needs to be an opt-in? Because some people are passionate and good at that kind of thing, and some people are not.
Without a shadow of a doubt. I just genuinely believe that if you are in a line responsibility, inherently things come with that badge, whether you like it or not. But I think this is where an organization has got to almost redefine what actually is the role of the leader, and also what does leadership mean within our organization. Because I think, again, context, different times. If I look at SAP, we're going through a transformation in our UKI organization. We're not relying just on our leaders, right, to drive this change. So we're looking at a multiplier model, right, where you've got a large number of individual contributors who are hopefully going to be the ones that will step in to some of the gaps, step into these spaces and really bring to life some of the behaviors that we really know that will be important in our environment, right? So I think it's looking at different models of how do you drive the behaviors that you wish to see that will help you in the future, because we're going to need different ones. Our ability to listen, our ability to communicate, our ability to tell stories, our ability to connect, all of these are alien to some people, and you can't fault them for that. But what organizations have now got to think about is how do we equip? How do we do that? I mean, this is one of the questions we'll ask David Williams from the perspective of impact is, how are you doing that? I see the question, how do you compensate those individual contributors? Great question. And I think in the context of ourselves, it's very experiential. We're not asking them to assume line responsibility. What we're asking them is to accept a challenge, to be part of the transformation, to exhibit and demonstrate really what we see as key behaviors. So, for example, creating a powerful feedback culture. How can we do that without relying on leaders modeling those behaviors? Because I just don't think we can wait anymore. So I think we're looking for individuals who are natural leaders, who may be in individual contributor roles, and that's largely what we've tried to do, is identify who they are. So, Becky, when we were prepping for today, one of the things we said, didn't we, was there's no right or wrong with any of this. It's a debate, right? What all we can all do is look at it and go, what are we hearing? What are we seeing? What are we understanding? Whether it's right or wrong, I don't know, but we have to respond. And I don't think anybody has got the final answer yet on exactly how this is going to play out. I think there's an element of experiment, try, reimagine, revisit. But I think the one thing we can't do is sit on our hands.
Yeah, and to tie a lot of these comments in, I think it's Nicole talking about, Nicole and Georgina talking about how different generations, different ages, different people in their career will have different needs and wants from work. 100% agree. And we've got, we ask in the Stay survey how happy people are working here on a scale of 1 to 10, on average, because it might fluctuate a lot in a day or in an hour. But amazing number of 8s, 9s and 10s, and and some of the 10s are from mothers who have returned either part-time or flexibly and have said, actually being here allows me to be a better mother because I've got the balance that I need. Some are nearing retirement and they're like, this is exactly what I need. I'm not after a stretch role, I'm not after progression, I can do this with my eyes closed and I really enjoy it. I like the people. So definitely kind of bearing that in mind. And then I think also I was thinking about a lot of companies at the moment are launching their 3 or their 5-year plan. And I don't know about you, but I feel better in life, not necessarily in work, in life if I have a goal. It might be to lose this many pounds or to run this many K or, whatever it might be, to buy a house. I need to have a goal of some sort. And I find when I feel a bit uneasy, it's normally because I've finished a goal or I don't have a goal. So I think, if you're a manager and you talk to your team, your direct reports, about whether they are a goal-focused person, whether goals are useful, you've got to take those massive 3-year plans and try and create a short-term goal for those people to work towards. Because I'll tell you when our loyalty and our, the morale was almost highest in the organization was when we first went into lockdown, and the mission was clear. The mission was, we need to keep everyone employed and we need to keep Iran going. So, that is the mission. And it was because we were like in wartime, it was
absolutely,
people were really stuck to that. And it was short term, it was very clear, it was very important. And so we've got to take those big 3 and 5-year plans and try and create really important, clear goals like that, I think, for people if they want them.
I agree. I love the distinction that you had in there, which is the short, the medium, the long, and also understanding what the objectives are of each person. That's fundamental. I'm at a different stage of my career. I'm 47 years of age. I don't have, and I've never had a career plan, right? So I've never had this aspiration of this role, that role, etc. Just never had it, and I absolutely don't. But do I want to grow? Yes. Do I want exposure to new experiences? Without a doubt. Am I a grumpy person when I get bored? Absolutely. And that goes back again to the DNA of the human being, right? Irrespective, we should never ever be judged by the role that we have. That's nonsense, right? We should always be looked at by the characteristics of who we are, and we know enough about the DNA of a human being that every day we want to achieve, as you mentioned, right? When we don't have that goal, we become slightly irritant and a bit bored, and then of course that's when engagement starts to dip, right? So that's where the onus on the organization is how do you classify and understand where each of your people are, and how do you manage that? Right. And for some it's simple, it's they want to continue in their current role. For others, they want to move through the organization, so you will manage slightly different, but the inherent basics should be exactly the same. And I think when it comes to talent and growth and all those things, I think it's opt in and opt out, right? And so
the stay surveys have been so helpful for that, because like you said, some people have said, well, I don't, that the question that you've got about whether there are opportunities to progress, but professionally and personally, well, I've kind of put, if I wanted them, because some people are not, that's not what they're after. They want to work, like Michael said, with Nicole, with nice people. They just want to enjoy coming to work and not be bored, and so people's goals are different. I want to I'm going to come on to the questions in a minute, but the last point I really wanted to talk about were some of the practical actions that have come out of the stay surveys, which is one of the questions, and we can go from there. So we said, on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you working here? And then we said, which people didn't expect, Michael, if it was an 8 or a 9 or even, a 7 or whatever, well, what would make it a 10? And they were like, oh, okay, which was a great question, because some people were like, oh, actually, I'll make my score higher because I can't think of anything. But the things that came out of that question were really practical. So things like, well, if the expenses were paid faster, that would be really good. Wow. I was like, well, I can take that away. I can sort that out. Let's change the approval process. The system we've got is good. Let's change the approval process. We don't need, our founding directors to approve everything. Let's see how we streamline that process. That's been really practical. Transparency of pay bands. People have been really happy with what they have. Financially, benefits and rewards are not really an issue. But they're like, I would like to know what the band is and how I could move up in my band without necessarily having to go for promotion. So that's an action that we're taking away as a senior leadership team. And then more structured and mandated training. So our approach to training, because consulting is quite varied, we've got people of different experience, different work streams, different specialities, different technologies. our approach is quite flexible and quite employee-led. So the idea is we've got 10 days of funded training every year, and you research what you need, you tell us what you need, and you can do it. We'll pay for it. And actually, there was some feedback that now that we're a bigger organization, and now that we bring in, you know, a population of grads, for example, there needs to be that baseline so everyone's got the consistent level of knowledge and skills as well. So that's really good. That's really practical. And, you know, we're kind of working on our Varan Academy now. And then just another thing which I didn't write down, but has just come into my mind, which is mentoring. So people feel very sticky in the organization when they've got more to do than just their role. So if people do a project role, you know, they've got kind of, okay, I've got the project. If people are a line manager as well, then they're line managing, they're developing people. If people are mentoring others, then they feel really involved, really loyal, because not only are they doing their day-to-day and line managing people, they're also upskilling others and coaching others. So, you know, we've always had that, but we're really encouraging people to do that more, especially when you're remote, because you're not getting the opportunities to kind of have that water cooler moment and say, oh, you know, I could mentor you about that, or I could teach you about that, or, you know, oh, maybe you could help me through that situation. So really encouraging people to do that more. And then committees as well. So another way that you can get people involved in things outside of just their day-to-day is, you know, kind of clubs, committees. Diversity and inclusion is massive at the moment. So it might be you set up a D&I forum or network. So other things that people can be involved in. And especially with the millennials and me personally, I'm very passionate about sustainability. I'm worried about the environment. So we're going to set up a sustainability committee, you know, that are responsible for that kind of thing, you know, and they can be quite autonomous as a group and come up with their strategy and their plan for how we can, you know, be a greener company. So there's some of the practical things that we're thinking of doing.
I love them. I love the fact that people still obviously care about the hygiene, right? So expenses being paid on time, you know, transparency of pay bands, right? They matter, right? They do matter. But I think this point about the structured and mandated, I think, is really crucial. So again, go back to the EVP, right? You know, part of the EVP is describing very, very clearly what do we expect of you and what will we do in return, right? It's that contract, yeah? And I think one of the biggest challenges that people have is, how do you articulate what the development proposition is, right? It's push and it's pull. For 20 years, we've had the 70-20-10 model looking at learning and development, and operationalizing it was almost neon impossible. But as we're now into this decade, how people learn has dramatically changed. You know, where do I go immediately when I want to find something out? I go to Google or I go to YouTube, right? People will share knowledge and content on YouTube without any idea whether anybody will ever watch it. But we're now creating a natural culture and community where people learn. But you have to put a structure around it. There still has to be a relevance and a meaning and a sort of a meaningfulness about the process. And so people need that guidance. I think when you talk there about mentoring, for me, the support structures that you put around an EVP, around an organization, is fundamental. You know, when I was at Premier Farnell, we were only 5,000 people globally. We had 500 mentoring relationships running at one time for two reasons: to orientate leaders, to accelerate the readiness of talent. You know, and that makes a fundamental impact on how people feel, how they navigate, how they progress, and how they feel a stretch and a challenge and a tension. So I think these are some of the things. It's great that you've done that, though. You learn, you learn. But
and some of them I was almost in tears, Michael, because people were, you know, people felt so there was very little line really between work and life. And I think we've almost looped all the way back to the beginning, which is that because of the pandemic and working at home and parents having their kids running around them and everything, you know, the line between work and life seems to have blurred a bit, which I've always been fine with. That's always been my preference. But, you know, it has felt during these surveys that people are wanting work to kind of, you know, merge in, you know, from a practical point of view, but also, you know, exactly what Richard is saying, which is to understand people's personal goals and link that and align it to what the business is trying to achieve. You know, they don't have to be separate.
Correct. I completely agree. Completely agree. And I think that then creates that connection and feeling of belonging even more. Go back to the thing, we're living and breathing day in, day out. You can't be complacent. You have to keep, it's hard yards. It's not easy, this, in any way, shape or form.
I know, and I'm aware of the time. I knew this would happen. I knew that we would have hours and hours of stuff to talk about. But is there anything else practical that you've seen businesses do, that SAP are doing? I think the internal mobility you talked about at Premier Farnell was amazing. Anything else practical that you think, oh, that's really good, and that people on the webinar can look into or think about for their own teams?
Yeah, so I think, like you mentioned, I'm very privileged that globally we have over 7,100 customers. It gives us the ability to stand back and to listen and to understand. So you see pockets, right? So you see pockets of where you see a really good EVP, or you see that there's some very clear processes along an employee proposition. I think some of the things that I've been really impressed with is the quality of listening. And not just listening for the sake of listening, but really listening and acting. I think that's been something I've been really impressed with over the pandemic in particular, because it surfaced new cultural norms. So I know one of my customers unearthed a new leadership model through the pandemic. So they did learn what was more appropriate for their business.
And someone said to me as well, actually, just on that point about listening and acting, someone said to me recently on a webinar that I was on, that it's people really appreciate leadership standing up and not always having the answers. So it might be, we've listened, we've heard that X is an issue or a challenge, we're working through it. We don't necessarily have the answer yet, and maybe we never will have the answer, but we've heard, we've heard it. So someone's just acknowledging what people are saying, even if you don't have an answer yet, goes down very well.
My biggest tip would be to challenge the organization philosophically. I actually think if you're in a HR position today, the badge of being the custodian of people will never go away. It's part and parcel. But I actually think there is an enormous opportunity if you are in a role that can influence the direction from a people perspective to really challenge the philosophical direction of the organization, because that will tie back to purpose. It will link into the EVP, because this is a philosophical debate. Because you've got to now work through what is our strategy around where people work. Because I think one of the questions we didn't quite get to was, firms who are mandating a return to the office, for example.
Yeah.
We could be here all afternoon discussing that. So again,
and that's come up in the chat as well. Like, the nice versus toxic. But all these are very emotional words that are coming up, and there are firms who are mandating a return. Early September.
They are. It's not going to land well. Let's be candid, it's not going to land well, right? So, SAP made the decision very early this year. We're now flex to work. So I think SAP learned a great deal, I think from the pandemic and how we worked. But again,
it's about choice, right? There are some organizations saying, right, we're closing all the offices, everyone's at home now, and people are thinking, oh my God, I'm going to be so lonely, and I'm not going to have anyone to.
You're right. You're right.
So really, choice is so important.
You're right, and don't forget, when we look at the Great Resignation, what you just described, that will feed into it, because that may not fit somebody else's choice. It's like, you're forcing me to go hybrid. I don't want to do that. So it's not just what would be obvious as they're not doing it well. It's also some of these choices about the future direction. So I think really looking at philosophically, how do we really build a people proposition? Because it is a philosophical debate. How do we attract talent? How do we now retain talent? How do we now look at the whole employee value cycle? So I think that's
my take home answer, my take home overall answer to all of that stuff is to ask people.
Correct.
So that we don't have to sit as a leadership team or a HR team in a room and try and figure this stuff out. We can ask people.
Absolutely.
That, I don't have the answer, but my top answer for now is to ask, to ask people what they want.
It was what Harriet Green said. Absolutely. She said, pull together diverse teams from all across the business and ask them, right, what constitutes a proposition that is compelling, it's authentic, it's believable, it's realistic, it's aligned to purpose, that can work, you know? And I think, yes, absolutely, be as inclusive as possible.
So I'm going to wrap us up, given the time. I've had so much fun, and I know that we're going to jump off this onto our debrief and carry on chatting until until we have our next meeting. But big shout out and thank you to Nicole, Richard, Joe. It's been probably our most lively webinar in terms of input from people. Georgina, it's really nice having people commenting, and it's obviously something that that we're passionate about, which is good. I'm glad that there was a time at the start of the crisis when it felt like HR were dealing with the whole crisis on their own, and and it was I was thinking, we've got to look after the HR people, because this is a big it's a people crisis, and people were worried about their employee safety and everything. But I think that there's a lot of passion in this thread from the HR people and business leaders to get this stuff right, which is great, because it's compassion, isn't it, basically? You're right.
You're right. It is. People care. I think that's the thing. I think as a community, I'm a huge fan of Gethin Nadine from Benefex, and we had Gethin on our podcast, and I was reading a paper that he has put out this week about the New Horizons, and he talked about community well-being. That's what this is, right? I think we are passionate about creating a future that really, really works for the majority, not the minority. And I think everybody's searching for answers and insights and tips and different ways of doing it, and because nobody's got all the answers. So no, I agree with you. It is. I've loved seeing the chat ping up, and it is a debate, right? So it's a debate.
Really, so thank you so much. Remind everyone on the webinar, how do they find the SAP webinars that you guys are running?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. So the Human Factor podcast, we launched in April. All of the episodes are on our channel on SoundCloud. We also have a channel on Spotify. The latest episode was released last week with Harriet Green. We got 2 episodes launching in September, one on the topic of data, and one actually on the convergence of technology and HR. And then we're really excited for anybody who listens to the High Performance podcast. We've got Professor Damien Hughes with us soon, talking about performance and the impact of no performance.
And I hope, guys, that if you're going to listen to some of these podcasts back, you do it while you're on a walk, while you're getting some fresh air. That's my recommendation for you. So thank you so much again, Michael. That was really, really good fun. And thank you everyone for joining, especially those people that are commenting. It's made it a really, really fun, really interesting discussion. And maybe there'll be a part 2 in the future. I think we need to carry on. So thank you again, everyone, and we'll see you soon.
Brilliant. Thanks, Becky. Thank you. Bye.